Tonight we travel into the Twilight Zone as we seek to examine the ancient question of what makes a good life on the Sci Phi Show. As we travel into the Twilight Zone, we stop at a story called A Nice Place to Visit. We meet a small-time thief named Rocky Valentine, who is killed after a robbery. Rocky wakes to meet his guide, a man named Pip, who knows everything about him. Pip is committed to the task of seeing that Rocky is taken care of and gets his every desire. Rocky soon learns this is not quite the paradise he expected or wanted. One of the things I think is interesting about this story is that it illustrates the difference between two very different conceptions of what makes a good life. The ancient Greeks had a word, eudaimonia, that has been translated in a number of different ways, often as happiness or human flourishing. The philosopher Peter Kreeft suggested that it might be properly translated as blessedness. Either way, to have eudaimonia is to have a life worth living. The history of philosophy is littered with people seeking to answer the question of what makes a life worthwhile. So this raises the question, what makes a life worth living? Rocky has everything he wants, and it is his to have by a simple act of will. Is this the most blessed of all possible lives? There's a conception of the good life, proposed by a school of ethical philosophy called hedonism, that sees the best life as that spent in the pursuit of pleasure, or at least the absence of suffering and pain. Although pleasure should not be understood as merely sensual pleasure, as there are higher pleasures of inquiring and philosophizing among others. Hedonistic philosophy is normally based in a starkly materialist conception of the world. The ancient hedonists didn't believe in a soul that can survive the death of the body, or in deities that care about the actions of human beings. Given these assumptions about the nature of reality, it doesn't seem possible to arrive at anything other than the hedonist conception of good and evil based in the experiences of pleasure and pain. Hedonistic philosophy has a long pedigree, and is believed to have been founded by an ancient student of Socrates named Aristippus of Cyrene, who is the earliest known proponent of a school of thought that raised pleasure to the status of the highest ethical good. Hedonistic schools of thought have existed in Eastern as well as Western philosophy, and appears to be a common feature of any purely materialist ethical philosophy. Hedonism is also at the root of more modern ethical philosophies like utilitarianism, that seeks to build an ethical system on a calculation of what maximizes happiness or pleasure for the greatest number, or at least the minimization of unhappiness and suffering, so that on balance happiness is maximized. Utilitarianism got its start with early proponents Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill during the Enlightenment. Today, one of the most well-known proponents of ethical utilitarianism is Professor Peter Singer of Princeton University. So it seems that philosophy has a long tradition of chasing after a world like the one Rocky Valentine has managed to find himself in. Yet Rocky finds the world he is stuck in to be anything but paradise. Is there any way for Rocky's world to be enjoyable? He seems to occupy a pocket universe that only he and Pip have any real control over. The girls and casino staff are merely props to be bent to Rocky's will as he sees fit. They aren't even really alive, but are just very sophisticated animatronic companions. They have no goals or desires of their own. They couldn't have. It would give them a will in opposition to Rocky's. Rocky wants to look up his old friends, but is informed that this is impossible in his pocket universe. The only beings that exist there are him and Pip, although Pip can leave. It couldn't be otherwise in Rocky's world, because if his will is king, then another being with will would render his kingship impossible, because there would inevitably be a conflict. There can only be one person sitting on the throne in Rocky's paradise, and that's Rocky himself, so his paradise must be a solitary one. The early hedonists, and even the more modern varieties, recognize that friendship itself is a wonderful good and can be a source of pleasure, but depending on what ultimate happiness looks like, is friendship going to be compatible with it? The interactions of wills may be enjoyable, but where two wills collide, one will end up imperfectly happy, or at least less happy than they would have been without unlimited freedom to do as they will. This would be why none of Rocky's friends can join him. There is another philosophical tradition that sits alongside hedonism and its pursuit of pleasure as the ultimate good, and it is represented in a number of different traditions. Two of these representatives are the ancient pagan philosopher Aristotle and the ancient Israelite philosopher King Solomon. Aristotle thought that the good life was an end in itself. Unlike his hedonist fellow travellers, Aristotle would deny that pleasure is the highest good. He would agree that the good life is pleasurable, but that it isn't in the pursuit of mere pleasure that a good life will be found. Aristotle thought that the good life involved living properly as a human being, that human beings had a proper end or function. There was a right way to live as a human being, and living as you ought to live will produce the best life. Aristotle looked at what was unique about human beings and concluded that our higher rational functions were the unique part of a human being, and therefore the proper functioning of a human being could be found in this unique capacity. He also noticed that a virtuous life was the most pleasant. He concluded that humans have two broad capacities of virtue, the intellectual and the moral. Intellectual virtues are acquired by teaching, and moral virtues are acquired by acting virtuously. Aristotle's theory of moral virtues will have to be the subject of another show, though. The philosopher King Solomon tells of his attempts to pursue hedonism in the book of Ecclesiastes. It chronicles his attempts to find fulfillment and pleasure in all things under the sun, be it hard work, hard partying, or hard philosophizing. In the end, he laments that all is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Interestingly, Solomon doesn't condemn any of these things themselves, and has many good things to say about the fruit of these pursuits. What he concludes, though, is that all of these things are futile because they will pass away with him, or be passed on to people that will lay waste to the good things he has created, thereby rendering the pursuit futile in the end. Solomon is looking for an end outside of himself. Solomon, as a good ancient Israelite, points people to God and to find the good life in keeping God's law and worshipping him. Rocky's world seems to elevate him to a place he isn't able to occupy, which is why it's his own subtle and personal hell. The one thing Rocky sought all his life, and upon getting it, he discovered it isn't what he wanted at all. It's interesting that a more modern author, Mur Lafferty, in a delightful story Heaven, that chronicles a trip through the afterlife, starts in the same place as a nice place to visit. The characters aren't criminals, but they come to the same understanding about the value of a heaven in which their will and every desire are paramount, and how it's ultimately unsatisfying. That humans require a challenge, that they cannot be the ultimate authority and in perfect control. In a scene from the second Matrix film that addresses the same question, we see the architect of the Matrix is critical of humanity and their inability to appreciate such a paradise. It's fascinating that the same theme of the good life comes up again and again, and each time it seems that the very nature of a human being is incompatible with a paradise that consists of a naked human will. Interestingly, the Christian philosopher C.S. Lewis also touches on exactly this topic in his wonderful little book, The Great Divorce. It paints a very dreary, rainy, miserable hell, but still a hell where people can have whatever they want just by wishing for it, and how this leaves them unhappy and unsatisfied, even though, again, it is what they have spent their whole life seeking. This obviously only scratches the surface, as one of the principal questions of what it is to be a human is the question about what provides meaning and purpose in life, and what makes life worth living. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on scifishow.com, and I can be reached for comments via thescifishow@gmail.com. You can also leave comments in the show notes at scifishow.com, and you can also leave comments on our Facebook page, facebook.com/scifishow. You can also follow the show via The Sci-Fi Show on Twitter. So, what makes your life worth living? The Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 license. The music is provided by Furious J and Maniacal M.